Juniper Gardens was a picturesque condominium complex nestled in the soft embrace of rolling suburbs. Composed of three-story buildings arranged around a central courtyard, the development boasted manicured flower beds, winding pathways lined with tall juniper trees, and a few tasteful sculptures that added an air of artistic flair. Residents here enjoyed relative tranquility, morning joggers weaving through the paths, retirees reading on sunlit benches, and young families watching their children discover the wonders of the shared green spaces. An active homeowners association, HOA, governed Juniper Gardens, setting guidelines to ensure a cohesive, well-maintained environment. While the majority of HOA policies were sensible, like rules about trash disposal times or restrictions on overly bright exterior paint, some regulations and board members proved more meddlesome than helpful. Chief among those contrarian figures was Sabrina Redfield, a middle-aged woman with meticulously styled hair, who insisted everyone call her by her first name, but behind her back, people had a less flattering moniker, Karen. Sabrina had lived in Juniper Gardens for 6 years and served on the HOA board for half that time. She was known for her officious nature. If a neighbor's potted plants extended 3 inches beyond a balcony railing, Sabrina would file a formal complaint. If a child's laughter in the courtyard echoed past 8 p.m., she would phone the HOA president to demand action. Yet it was her most recent obsession, targeting a group of deaf residents who communicated via American Sign Language, ASL, that would spark the greatest outcry the complex had ever witnessed. The courtyard at the center of Juniper Gardens was an oasis of calm, set apart from the urban bustle outside the development's gates. It featured winding brick pathways, a few circular patches of lush grass, and clusters of benches under trimmed willow trees. A modest fountain bubbled cheerfully near the middle, providing a gentle soundtrack of trickling water. Residents often passed through the courtyard on their way to the parking lot or mail center, pausing to chat or simply enjoy a moment of fresh air. Among those who cherished the courtyard were Marina O'Donnell and Carlos Jimenez, 2 residents who were part of the deaf community. They and a handful of other deaf or hard-of-hearing residents found the courtyard an ideal spot to socialize. They'd gather in a circle of benches, hands alive with motion, exchanging stories and jokes in ASL. Passers-by would sometimes watch the graceful dance of signing, even if they couldn't understand it fully. Most found it fascinating and were happy that Juniper Gardens fostered such inclusivity. Marina, a vivacious woman in her early 30s, rented a condo on the 2nd floor of Building B. She worked at a local nonprofit advocating for deaf rights. Carlos, nearing 40, was a freelance graphic designer who owned a unit in Building C. Though they'd met only a year ago, they'd formed a friendship based on mutual interests, hiking, coffee, and forging community within Juniper Gardens. Over time, they'd been joined by a small circle of deaf and hearing-impaired neighbors who enjoyed signing in the open air. This presence of deaf culture in the courtyard brought a new dimension of diversity, which most neighbors celebrated. Little did they know that Sabrina Redfield would see it differently. Sabrina Redfield prided herself on maintaining standards at Juniper Gardens. She walked the courtyard daily, scanning for any signs of rule-breaking. One evening, as she strolled past the fountain, she noticed Marina, Carlos, and 3 other deaf neighbors signing animatedly on a bench. Sabrina paused, watching with a slight frown. The group's hands flew in fluid motion, occasionally accompanied by wide smiles or laughter. It was a lively scene, though devoid of spoken words. A prickling sense of unease crept over Sabrina. She couldn't hear them, but she could tell from their expressions that they were enjoying a private conversation, one she couldn't eavesdrop on. Something about their silent camaraderie disturbed her. She'd never harbored any overt prejudice toward deaf people, yet a subtle discomfort welled up. Perhaps it was the unfamiliarity or a sense of exclusion. Regardless, Sabrina walked away in a huff, her mind churning with indignation. That night, she sent an email to the HOA board's group address. Subject: concern regarding courtyard activities. Dear fellow board members, I've noticed a gathering of residents using sign language in the courtyard. While I respect their communication style, it's somewhat disruptive visually and might make others uncomfortable. I'd like us to discuss any guidelines about group gatherings in the courtyard, especially activities that might cause unease. Best, Sabrina Redfield. Several board members read the email and rolled their eyes. disruptive visually. They recognized Sabrina's pattern. She often turned personal annoyances into formal complaints. Yet with no legitimate reason to single out sign language, the board members brushed off the email, politely replying that if the group was merely conversing, there was no violation. Sabrina seethed at the lack of support. She believed the courtyard was for quiet, polite conversation, not flailing hands. Her words, not theirs. If the board wouldn't act, maybe she'd have to take matters into her own hands. Unaware of Sabrina's growing agitation, Marina and Carlos continued meeting friends in the courtyard. Often, hearing neighbors sat with them, picking up basic ASL signs, like hello, thank you, or nice to meet you. The courtyard became a mini laboratory of cross-cultural exchange. Some folks even asked Marina for resources to learn more. Sensing a need, she pinned a small flyer on the communal bulletin board near the mail center. Free ASL practice meetups. Come learn basic American Sign Language in a casual setting. Every Tuesday at 6 p.m. in the courtyard. Open to all residents. The response exceeded her expectations. Within days, half a dozen neighbors expressed interest. Some had deaf relatives and wanted to improve communication. Others were simply curious or recognized the value of bridging a gap in their community. Marina glowed with excitement. Juniper Gardens might become an inclusive example for the broader region. Sabrina, of course, spotted the flyer. She frowned at the bright, bold letters. Another email poured out of her that evening, complaining that the group was soliciting in the courtyard without official HOA approval. Once again, the board disregarded her complaint. This was a free, resident-led gathering, well within the guidelines that allowed small communal activities. Furious, Sabrina decided to escalate matters further. Sabrina's frustration simmered. She took to patrolling the courtyard more frequently, scowling whenever she saw Marina or Carlos engaged in lively sign conversations. Some deaf residents noticed her glaring from afar. A sense of unease crept into the group. The meeting times grew more formal, and the deaf neighbors tried not to let Sabrina's presence dampen their spirits, but the tension was hard to ignore. One weekend afternoon, Sabrina cornered Carlos by the mail center. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "I'd like a word." Carlos, who had limited hearing, glanced at her lips. He caught the gist of her statement and nodded politely, pulling out his phone so he could type or speech read if needed. "Yes," he said, enunciating carefully. Sabrina frowned, expecting him to sign. "Your courtyard sessions are making some neighbors uncomfortable," she said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "We can't have big gatherings out there at all hours. It's visually distracting. And frankly, she hesitated, searching for the right words. Carlos managed to read enough of her lips to glean that she was complaining. He typed a quick response on his phone. "We meet only once or twice a week, usually late afternoon or early evening. We're not violating any rules. No one else has complained that we know of." Sabrina's face reddened. "Well, maybe they haven't complained because they don't want to offend you. But trust me, many share my concerns. This sign language," she paused, as if the word itself were distasteful. "It's off-putting." Carlos felt a sting in his chest. He typed again. "Off-putting how? We're just talking, same as anyone else." "Well, that's your opinion," Sabrina snapped, then stalked off, leaving Carlos unsettled. He relayed the incident to Marina and the others. They collectively sighed, realizing a storm of bigotry was brewing. Yet they resolved not to let Sabrina's hostility deter them. If anything, the group planned to meet more often, determined to assert their right to be seen and accepted. The confrontation reached a boiling point on a mild spring evening. About 10 people, deaf, hard of hearing, and hearing allies, had gathered for an informal ASL practice session. Marina stood near the fountain, leading a mini lesson on basic signs for family, work, and hobbies. The group laughed and signed, some occasionally voicing a question for clarity. Suddenly, Sabrina appeared, marching down the path with a face taut with anger. She stopped a few yards away, arms folded, glaring at the group. The lively signing continued. Finally, Sabrina snapped. "That's enough," she shrieked, startling those close enough to hear. Even the deaf folks noticed her visible fury, the tension in her body. She waved her arms in a mocking imitation of signing. "You people with your flapping hands. It's making everyone uneasy." Marina felt her stomach drop. She read Sabrina's lips enough to catch the word uneasy and recognized Sabrina's mocking gestures. A hush fell over the group. A hearing ally, Mary, spoke up. "Excuse me, Ms. Redfield, we're simply practicing ASL. It's a recognized language." Sabrina's eyes flashed. "I don't care what you call it. It makes me uncomfortable. This is a public courtyard, and we have rules. No large gatherings without permission." And I, a deaf man, Tony, typed a quick note on his phone, showing it to Sabrina. "We're not harming anyone. Why does it bother you so much?" She scowled at the screen. "It's invasive. All that waving around. Some people might find it offensive or confusing. Why can't you just speak if you need to talk?" A collective gasp rippled through the group. Tony, outraged, typed again, explaining, "We can't hear. Sign is our language. This is basic respect." But Sabrina was too riled to listen. She pointed an accusatory finger at the deaf residents, her voice rising. "Well, I have rights too, and I don't want to see it. This is my courtyard as much as anyone else's." The outburst shocked onlookers. A couple of neighbors passing by froze, appalled. Then, as quickly as she'd arrived, Sabrina spun on her heel and stormed away, leaving the group stunned and upset. Some fought tears. Rarely had they faced such overt hostility in their own home environment. Others bristled with anger, vowing to file a formal complaint. The seeds of a community reckoning had been sown. News of Sabrina's meltdown spread throughout Juniper Gardens the next day. Residents murmured in hallways, outraged by her insensitivity. Complaints flooded the HOA board's inbox, urging them to denounce Sabrina's bigotry. Meanwhile, the deaf group grew more determined to continue their gatherings. They pinned a new flyer in the mail center advertising an expanded schedule of ASL practice. It read, "ASL workshops, everyone welcome. Monday and Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m., Courtyard. Learn a new language, meet new friends. Let's build an inclusive community together." That same afternoon, a neighbor, Kim, saw Sabrina prowling around the mail center bulletin board. Sabrina, with a furious glare, snatched the flyer advertising the ASL workshops and tore it from the board. The ripping sound echoed in the silent hall. Kim gasped in horror, stepping forward. "Sabrina, what are you doing? That's community information." Sabrina sneered, crumpling the paper. "It's propaganda. We don't need more of their nonsense." Kim tried to snatch the flyer piece from Sabrina's hand, but she stuffed it into her purse. "I'm on the HOA board, and I say it's not authorized," Sabrina declared, then marched out. Kim stood there shell-shocked. Trembling with anger, Kim raced to find Marina and Carlos, letting them know what had happened. They were devastated. This wasn't just an email complaint or a hateful glare. This was physical destruction of an inclusive message. The gloves were off. When word of the ripped poster spread, a wave of outrage consumed Juniper Gardens. Neighbors who previously stayed neutral came forward, condemning Sabrina's actions as blatant discrimination. A small coalition formed, both deaf and hearing residents, vowing to defend the ASL group. Marina, though shaken, refused to back down. She and Carlos created another flyer, bigger and brighter, announcing the same workshop details. This time, they plastered it across multiple areas: the elevator lobbies, laundry room, and even the official community website's events page. If Sabrina tore one poster, 5 more popped up in its place. Mrs. Liu, an elderly neighbor with partial hearing loss, told Carlos she'd never felt so validated. "I've always been a bit hesitant to sign in public," she admitted, fearful of stares or negative reactions. "But your group gave me courage." Parents with hearing children also joined the cause, seeing an opportunity to teach them empathy and another language. They told each other, "Let's show that hateful acts won't silence these neighbors." Meanwhile, the HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting, spurred by the complaints about Sabrina's aggression. Sabrina, feeling cornered, doubled down on her stance. She complained to the board about unauthorized postings, ranting about a visual assault in the courtyard. The board's exasperated president, Bob Cummings, recognized a brewing civil rights issue. He told Sabrina point-blank that she was overstepping, but she remained unrepentant. The tension soared. Soon, the HOA received formal letters from deaf residents and allies, detailing Sabrina's hateful remarks and the vandalized poster. Another letter arrived from an outside deaf advocacy group that Marina had contacted. The letters demanded that Juniper Gardens take a stand against discrimination and ensure deaf residents felt safe and respected. Some threatened legal action, pointing out that refusing to allow sign language or harassing deaf people could violate fair housing regulations and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. The board realized they faced a serious liability if they didn't act promptly. Sabrina tried to mount a defense, emailing the board a tirade about how her rights were being overlooked and that the signers were imposing on others. No one was swayed. One board member, Elena Rossi, fired back. The courtyard is for all residents, including those who communicate in ASL. We do not condone intimidation or destruction of posted materials. Realizing the severity of the situation, the board scheduled an open community meeting for the next week, inviting all residents to voice concerns and propose solutions. Marina, Carlos, and their allies prepared testimonies, determined to highlight how vital inclusivity was for Juniper Gardens. Sabrina, incensed, planned to defend herself, but found her usual bravado wavering under the weight of public condemnation. In the days leading up to the meeting, a grassroots movement blossomed. Word spread across social media and the condo's online forum that the deaf residents were hosting free mini-classes in ASL, with coffee and snacks provided by volunteer neighbors. The first official session took place near the fountain on a warm Sunday morning. Families arrived in droves, more than 20 people, all curious to learn. Marina and Carlos stood at the front, demonstrating basic signs. The alphabet, greetings like hello and nice to meet you, and essential phrases such as, where is the restroom? Or how are you? A deaf mother taught a sign for coffee, drawing laughs as participants practiced the fluid motions. The atmosphere felt jubilant, united by a common goal of bridging communication gaps. Many participants expressed shock that a neighbor had tried to silence this positive initiative. They sipped coffee and exchanged glances, determined not to let bigotry define their community. Some posted photos of the event on social media, tagging them with #InclusiveJuniper. As the pictures circulated, more residents pledged to attend the next session. Thus, while Sabrina fumed behind closed doors, the rest of Juniper Gardens rallied around the deaf community with renewed vigor. Her attempt to quell sign language ironically garnered it more publicity, making the classes even more popular. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation at the upcoming HOA meeting. On a balmy Tuesday evening, residents filed into the condo's community hall for the special HOA meeting. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the board members sat. The tension was palpable. Sabrina Redfield arrived early, seat on the far right, face drawn. She wore a crisp blazer, her posture stiff with indignation. The board president, Bob Cummings, sat in the center, flanked by 4 other members, including Elena Rossi, who had been outspoken about supporting the deaf group. By 7 o'clock, the hall was packed. Standing room only for many who came to watch the spectacle. Marina and Carlos sat near the front with several deaf neighbors, some accompanied by interpreters or hearing allies. A hush fell as Bob tapped his gavel lightly, calling the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming, Bob began, glancing at the sea of expectant faces. We've convened this session to address recent incidents involving the deaf community's ASL gatherings, as well as certain complaints and destructive actions. He cleared his throat. We want to reaffirm that Juniper Gardens is a place for all residents, including those with disabilities or who use alternate communication methods. Let's proceed with courtesy. Sabrina tensed, arms crossed. She cast a wary eye at the deaf delegation, noticing the interpreters ready to relay everything said. She mustered the last of her bravado, still believing she was right. Bob opened the floor for statements. Marina stood first, accompanied by an ASL interpreter who voiced her words. Thank you, Mr. Cummings and members of the HOA, Marina signed, her interpreter translating in a firm, clear voice. We, the deaf and hard-of-hearing residents, have lived here peacefully, paying our dues and respecting guidelines. We communicate through sign language, our natural, essential mode of communication. Recently, we've faced hostility from Ms. Redfield, who yelled that our language makes her uncomfortable and tore down our flyers. This has hurt and alarmed us. Across the room, heads nodded. Some supporters clapped softly. Marina continued. We only want to enjoy the courtyard. teach neighbors who are curious, and live without fear of harassment. We ask for a formal statement from the HOA, reaffirming that sign language is welcome and that any attempts to silence or intimidate deaf residents will be addressed. Next, Carlos stepped forward, using the same interpreter. I love Juniper Gardens. It's been my home for 5 years. But these last few weeks have been the first time I've felt truly unsafe, worried that a board member hates my language. We're not a threat. We're not disturbing the peace. Our gatherings are calm, occasionally even quieter than spoken conversations. Please support us in ensuring we're treated equally. Applause erupted, genuine and heartfelt. Sabrina glowered, tapping her foot impatiently, waiting for her chance to respond. Bob nodded to Sabrina, who stood with forced composure. She faced the crowd, noticing the sea of skeptical eyes. Still, she pressed on. I want to clarify, Sabrina began, that I have nothing against deaf residents personally. My concern is that large group signings can be visually distracting to passersby. The courtyard is a shared space, and we must consider everyone's comfort. Some might find the rapid hand movements unsettling, like an invasion of personal space. Plus, the flyers posted everywhere weren't approved by the HOA. I only removed one because it was in violation. Her voice shook with a mix of anger and defensiveness. I respect differences, but I also have a right not to feel uneasy. This community has standards about group activities. Shouldn't they apply to sign language classes too? And if I was upset, it's because the board ignored my concerns. The audience murmured. Many glared, outraged by her attempt to frame sign language as unsettling. One father shook his head, whispering to his wife, "Unbelievable." The deaf residents looked at each other, some exhaling in frustration. Sabrina turned to Bob, concluding, I stand by my actions. I might have been too hasty tearing a poster, but it was unauthorized. That's all. Her arms crossed, she sat down with a defiant glare, half expecting some support from the crowd. Instead, a tense silence reigned. With Sabrina's statement done, the floodgates opened for other residents. One by one, they stepped to the microphone. Mrs. Patel, a neighbor with a deaf niece. Sign language is beautiful and normal. My niece visits occasionally, and the idea that her communication is unsettling is deeply offensive. Mr. Williams, an older retiree, I pass by the courtyard daily. The deaf group never disturbed me. I find it peaceful. Ms. Redfield's meltdown was the real disturbance. Kim, who witnessed the poster ripping, I saw Sabrina tear down that flyer. It wasn't an accidental removal. It was deliberate. That's vandalism and a clear sign of hostility. Elena Rossi, board member. We must align with legal and moral obligations. Harassing deaf residents or censoring their language is discriminatory. I propose we formally censure Ms. Redfield for misconduct. Applause punctuated each statement. The momentum was overwhelmingly against Sabrina. She huddled lower in her seat, fury burning behind her eyes. Bob jotted notes, quietly relieved that the community seemed unified in rejecting Sabrina's stance. Finally, after nearly an hour of testimony, the board signaled they'd heard enough. Bob promised a quick closed-session discussion to determine next steps. The meeting paused as the board members retired to a side room. Residents milled about in hushed anticipation. Marina and Carlos, accompanied by deaf allies, tried to interpret the vibe. Most recognized the board would likely reprimand Sabrina, but the extent of consequences remained unclear. After 10 minutes, Bob and the others returned. The crowd fell silent as Bob cleared his throat. We've reviewed all statements regarding the hostility towards deaf residents and the destruction of posted materials. While Ms. Redfield claims she acted out of personal discomfort, the board finds her actions inappropriate and discriminatory, potentially violating our code of conduct and the spirit of inclusive living at Juniper Gardens. Sabrina bristled at these words, eyes darting across the room. Bob continued, we are issuing an official censure of Ms. Redfield for these actions. Additionally, the board will release a formal statement reaffirming that American Sign Language is fully welcome in our community and that any intimidation or tearing down of informational flyers is strictly prohibited. A ripple of relieved applause spread. Sabrina opened her mouth to protest, but Bob held up a hand. This is the board's final decision. Juniper Gardens will also set guidelines ensuring residents can hold free workshops like the ASL sessions without needing special permission, as long as they follow basic courtesy rules. The applause intensified. Deaf residents smiled in relief, some signing "thank you" repeatedly toward the board. While Sabrina seethed, she had no recourse left. She'd been publicly condemned, her power severely diminished. The board's statement, posted in communal areas and emailed to all residents, read in part. Official HOA statement on inclusivity. We affirm that Juniper Gardens is a home for all, regardless of communication style or ability. American Sign Language, ASL, and other forms of deaf/hard of hearing expression are welcome throughout our common spaces, including the courtyard. We reject any acts of intimidation or vandalism targeting deaf residents or their promotional materials. Moving forward, any group wishing to hold free classes or language exchanges may do so without special approval, so long as they do not impede safety or block walkways. Let this serve as a reminder of our commitment to fostering a respectful, inclusive environment for everyone in our community. Residents buzzed with appreciation for the strong stance. Deaf neighbors felt vindicated and safer. The weekly ASL sessions expanded from a small circle to a larger gathering, with more hearing neighbors curious than ever. Carlos joked that Sabrina's outburst was the best advertisement they could have hoped for. Never had so many people asked to learn sign language. Sabrina, now cowering under social backlash, tried to keep a low profile. She considered resigning from the board but clung to her seat, claiming she wouldn't be bullied out. Yet her previous zeal for policing minor infractions faded. Few took her complaints seriously. Weeks passed, and the atmosphere in Juniper Gardens blossomed with inclusivity. The courtyard bustled with signing sessions, friendly chats, and even hearing folks practicing finger spelling as they walked to their units. A surprising side effect was that it brought neighbors closer overall, bridging age and cultural gaps. One late afternoon, Sabrina lingered near the courtyard, observing a group lesson from a distance. She saw children and seniors learning how to sign short phrases, guided patiently by Marina. The scene was joyful, exuding warmth. A pang of regret flickered inside Sabrina, though she would never admit it openly. She began to realize she'd become a pariah, her bigotry overshadowing any positive contributions she once made. Hesitating, Sabrina approached Marina after the lesson ended. Marina stiffened, aware of Sabrina's presence. In halting words, Sabrina mumbled, "Look, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for ripping your poster and yelling. I guess I overreacted." Marina, taken aback, studied Sabrina's face. She recognized genuine discomfort. "I appreciate your words," she signed slowly, with an interpreter at her side. "It hurt us deeply. I hope you understand that sign language is vital for us, like breathing or speaking is for you." Sabrina nodded, swallowing her pride. "I do. I guess I was uncomfortable. Anyway, I'm sorry." Without waiting for a longer discussion, she retreated, leaving Marina uncertain if Sabrina's remorse was sincere or simply a bid to save face. Still, it was a sliver of reconciliation. The ASL workshops continued to thrive, now branded as Juniper ASL Club. The board even allocated a small budget for snacks and refreshments, a gesture of solidarity. New flyers popped up regularly, unmolested this time, and a schedule of sessions extended into evenings and weekends. Some neighbors who initially hesitated found themselves enthralled by the grace and nuance of visual communication. Marina and Carlos became local celebrities of sorts. Everyone seemed to know them, greeting them with a friendly wave or practicing a newly learned sign. Deaf residents who once felt isolated reported a sense of acceptance they'd rarely experienced in other apartment complexes. Children, especially, took to signing with ease, proving the adage that young minds absorb languages quickly. In her condo, Sabrina heard the same quiet bustle in the courtyard. Now, though, it no longer fueled her anger. She realized the noisy silence she once found unsettling was just a group of neighbors bonding. She kept her curtains drawn, uncertain how to rejoin a community she'd alienated. She occasionally left small notes for the board, none of them addressing the deaf residents, mostly trivial concerns about landscaping. The board rarely humored them. As summer drifted into autumn, the temperature cooled, and orange and yellow leaves sprinkled the courtyard paths. The Juniper ASL Club planned a special holiday gathering, a potluck brunch in the courtyard, complete with sign language games, deaf culture trivia, and a small fundraiser for a local deaf children's charity. Neighbors volunteered to decorate, setting up tables laden with pumpkin pies, spiced cider, and an array of baked goods. When the day arrived, the courtyard brimmed with energy. Twinkling lights strung along the trellises, festive centerpieces on the tables. Deaf children signed excitedly with hearing friends, practicing newly learned holiday words. The warm hum of social exchange enveloped the space. Even people from outside Juniper Gardens, invited by residents, came to participate. Sabrina hovered on the periphery, drawn by curiosity but still feeling unwelcome. She had no illusions that her presence would be celebrated. But seeing the joyous atmosphere, she experienced an unfamiliar tug of longing, an echo of regret that she'd chosen hostility over understanding. She quietly approached a table, nodding at neighbors who gave polite but reserved greetings. Marina saw Sabrina, noticing her timid stance. In a moment of grace, Marina signed to an interpreter who approached Sabrina. "We have coffee, pastries, and an open seat if you'd like to join. No pressure." Sabrina, startled by the invitation, muttered, "Aye, sure. Maybe for a minute." She sat, sipping a hot cider. She watched as people signed around her, occasionally slowing to voice or interpret so she'd understand. It dawned on Sabrina that the uncomfortable feeling she'd harbored was partly ignorance, partly fear of the unknown. Here, no one seemed angry with her, merely cautious, hoping she wouldn't lash out again. In the ensuing weeks, the potluck's success echoed through Juniper Gardens. Residents reminisced about the deaf culture trivia game, the delicious homemade treats, and the glimpses of genuine unity. The Juniper ASL Club planned monthly events, forging a lasting tradition. Sabrina Redfield stayed on the HOA board until her term ended, but her influence waned. She rarely confronted the deaf group again, and though she didn't become their champion, she refrained from further attacks. Some nights, she even glanced out her window, watching the graceful signing by the fountain, and felt an odd mixture of regret and humble acceptance. Marina and Carlos, buoyed by the welcoming environment, turned their small workshop into a formal weekly class with guest speakers from the deaf community. The HOA, eager to spotlight its new era of inclusivity, showcased the club on its official website. Over time, Juniper Gardens gained a reputation in the wider region as a friendly place for deaf and hearing people alike, a quiet suburban condo complex that had weathered bigotry and emerged stronger. When new residents toured the courtyard, they sometimes saw a circle of signers practicing the ASL alphabet or sharing jokes. A posted sign read, "ASL class here, all welcome." It was a testament to how a single act of hatred, like ripping a poster, could backfire spectacularly. By trying to squelch deaf expression, Sabrina had inadvertently galvanized the entire community to embrace it more. And so, the story ended not with permanent rancor, but with an enduring spirit of solidarity. Karen's meltdown had ironically awakened Juniper Gardens to the power and beauty of sign language. The courtyard remained a haven, its benches occupied by an ever-growing circle of hands in motion, speaking silently, yet resonating with acceptance and hope for a more inclusive future.